goals.
Right. And so I'm learning that very much in my life to show up as like almost a performer, not just an explainer, not just this is how it is mentally, and now you go do it, but like actually be a demonstration of, my own growing process as well.
Yeah. I think you're doing a great job. I think you're on the pathway there.
Appreciate that. I can feel my inner 3-year-old like, oh, I got feedback. That's awesome. Yay. Thank you.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Once again, we have Christian Rivera, special guest host, back with us. Welcome, Christian.
Hi. Excited to always be here.
So just so if you're following along, you weren't here part of the episode last week, or you don't know who Christian is, INTP Preferences. You work with us in a bunch of different roles, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, art director, producer. You're helping us guide our Quest calls now, which are the Quest membership program we do on Sundays, live calls, and you're very involved.
Yeah. Having conversations, chatting with the listeners and people who come into the Quest call specifically into our Zoom calls, and having conversations about the podcast topic and then how we can start to transition some of these more heady concepts into our lives.
Yeah.
So.
If you want to be part of those Quest calls, the Quest program, so we call it a Personality Quest, coming together right now at the time of this recording on Sundays. We gather, we watch a podcast episode together as a tribe, a community, and then members gather on Zoom right afterward in our Personality Quest. We talk about how to apply the episode to our lives, what are the personal growth avenues and personality type understanding we can take away from it. And then we give everybody a challenge for the week we call a Personality Quest, to go out in the world and test something. Go check something in your real life and come back the next week and report the findings. And then we keep doing that cadence every week together as a community of growth-minded people, which I think is awesome. And so you're very involved in that. Head over to personalityhacker.com/quest if you want to be a part of it. But let's get into today's topic. So last week we opened up this idea of a meta model, Christian. Talked about this model from Ken Wilber. And if you haven't heard the framing of it, go back and listen to the last episode. We'll briefly catch you up here, and we can do that in a moment. But it's the framework of grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up. And we're going to take some creative liberties. But why don't you reorientate us to what we talked about last week, Christian, and help get us started.
Well, essentially, I think about this big picture model, which I tend to bring these big models to our conversations. We talked about generational theory in the past and, a lot of stuff. And I have a intimate connection with what we do here and have been a part of programs. I've been a part of Personality Life Path and Profiler training. And I get to see these different avenues of how people are developing through their lives. We get all sorts of different people from different walks of life and different moments in the timeline of their existence. And so this framework of grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up is the closest that I've seen to something that is a way that we can start to track what that process is like, and then really start to unfold them into some deeper meta models or different ways of understanding what's called spiral development, or what I'm calling spiral development.
Yeah.
There's things like spiral dynamics, integral theory, the stages model, which I'm going to introduce a couple of models in this episode, specifically talking about the grow up process and how we can start to think about this methodology or this progressing through our lives as a method of aligning inner work and outer work, so that what we're doing here with Personality Hacker is trying to bring personality type alive in your life. And it's taking that inner work into the outer work. But as we talk through the growth process, so we talk about maturing and accelerating your maturity, which a lot of people come to personality types attempting to do, and usually using this material to start to do that, we can start to figure out not for you, but with you, and then support you in navigating that inner and outer work terrain back and forth.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about grow up, the first part of this.
Yeah.
So I'll just frame it from a very casual initial impression standpoint. So if you're watching or listening, you're like, okay, I'm here watching the episode. You might be attuning to something like myself. Like I'm thinking about two primary things. The first one is when I think of the word grow up or the terms grow up or any kind of maturation, I think of, okay, a child that's born and they go through a general growing up process. And there's certain things that happen developmentally for most children to become adults. And the second thing I think of is a bunch of young people, and some people even in middle age, using this phrase of, I'm adulting, right? This idea of adulting in life. And I always think of that person, like, do you feel like you didn't grow up? Like, do you feel like you are not an adult. You never achieved adult status and you have to have an affectation of adulting.
Mm-hmm.
Like you made it into a verb instead of a noun for yourself. Like you didn't nominalize it. So what's going on there? And that's always interesting when somebody talks about adulting. Mm-hmm. So those are the two things that immediately come up for me when I think about growing up.
Right.
Do you guys have anything else that just in a casual way comes up for you when you think about this?
Well, I think that makes sense to think about the word growing up or maturity. It's often I hear in like the personality type space, there's always this idea of like, is someone healthy or unhealthy? We think about, is someone mature or immature? And that's not necessarily the frame that we're coming with here, but it's the idea that we are continuing to mature as a person. Like there is both the natural developmental cycles of just going through like childhood and young adulthood and midlife and elderhood, but that there is this, we tend to focus on sort of the judgmental aspects. It's like, are you acting like a child? Like there's a lot of judgment around the phrasing of adulting. There can be, right? Because it's like, have you not grown up yet? Or it's like, do you not feel like you've grown up yet? It kind of depends on the angle you're coming from, right? So, maturing, we talked about or I've heard you guys talk about on the podcast episode, starting to use this phrasing or framework around personal growth being about accelerating the maturity. And really it's from Ken Wilber's perspective and the framework we're bringing, it's accelerating maturity of the conventional concrete self. What that means is like accelerating, in our terms, accelerating the maturity of our experience in the world around us more directly. Like we get very distracted by sort of abstractions, news cycles, big picture things, but that's not the concrete reality of what's in front of us and what we're experiencing, right? So the conventional concrete self, how are we developing? Like if you think about our physical bodies developing as you go from a toddler to childhood to adolescent, awkward, lanky phases to, muscle groups developing. And then you get mature muscle growth as you get older. It's not just, there's the natural process of that. Like your muscles are going to mature in a certain way anyway, but then there's how do you now start to take the physical body, for example, and start to hone in on a growth process that actually supports you being able to optimize, not just for physical look, but for perhaps performance or just being able to breathe easier when you walk up the stairs, like, things like that, so that's the general idea, I think, of what growing up is from my frame, aside from those assumptions of what it means to be mature relative to like judgments and stuff like that.
Yeah. And from my perspective, at least for me, it's been really helpful to see growth and growing up through multiple channels. So there's like some areas where when I was growing up, right, like I was physically growing up, there were some areas that were just natural to me. They were just more native to how I thought. And I believe that I outpaced other people in my growth in those things because it was just really natural to focus on them. And then there were other areas where I was a little behind everybody else because they weren't native. And then there were some areas that just were not on my radar at all. So if I grew in those areas, it was kind of incidental and it happened to me and I couldn't take any credit for it. So to me, growing up also means understanding that maturity is stratified, right? It's stratified over many areas of one's life. And I think the reason why I started to see personal growth as accelerated maturity is we usually get into growth and development because we are behind in some ways. And the world expects us to be further along. It's like, well, you're at this age now, so you should be showing up in this way, right? Like for your age level, for this category.
Right.
And if we're behind, it causes a lot of problems. And I think we get into growth and development specifically because we're like, oh, I got to catch up, right? And so then we watch ourselves grow in that way, in that category. Faster than we would have done had it been a natural process, had we just done it naturally, had we been tuned into that area of our life.
Right.
And so then we get a taste of it, right? We get a taste of the acceleration of maturity and we go, what else can I apply this to?
Right.
And so for me, I think part of growing up is understanding that there's a natural maturity process that happens that we may or may not be on pace with. And that natural maturity process happens stratified over a bunch of different channels of our life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're behind and sometimes we're ahead. And sometimes we have absolutely no idea because we're not auditing that because it's not on our radar.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of, for me, I've realized the growing up process is, I have to keep my fingers on a lot of pulses, not just one. And I can't use the one channel in which I'm ahead of everybody else as my key performance indicator across all the channels, right? I can't be like, see, I'm super mature because I'm super mature in this one way. It's like, but there's probably something that took a hit because I was hyper focusing on that at the cost of what.
Right.
And so a part of this too is like understanding that it's not just be a more mature version of yourself. It's like, there might be some areas that I need to expand my focus and take in larger territory in order to do an accurate assessment.
Right. So it's kind of like what you're speaking to is this sort of natural, almost unconscious growing experience. It's like we're just navigating the world, doing the thing that we feel like we're supposed to do or we should do, or the way that we need to operate based on our personality or based on whatever we're surrounded by.
This is very much where type comes in, by the way.
It is very much where type comes in because at some point when you start to, and we'll get into what waking up is, which is the next episode, it's this idea of perhaps you have a moment in your life where you realize you've made a whole bunch of mistakes and then you need to become conscious of your growth process. It's like you said, you're behind and suddenly you're like, I need to catch up. So how do I start to catch up? I become more conscious of a growth process. Sometimes in the case, we're going to talk about a couple of mental models and you can use that.
Yeah.
But in other cases, sometimes you turn to a religion that gives you, there's stuff in a book that gives you tips on how to become a much more well-behaved person. Or you turn to, in the past, they would have turned to avatars or gods or anything like that. I watch wrestling, and when there are kids at a certain age, you might look at a wrestler and embody the archetype that wrestler character kind of brings. And you might be trying that on to try something different than what you've already experienced. Right. So at some point, growing up moves from an unconscious process to a conscious process. And that's what I mean when we're referencing it in this episode. It's like, I think Ken Wilber says that growth begins when you take the role of other. It's kind of the theory of mind idea. And you start to notice that there are other people around you. And it's like this process of, I'm not this, I'm not that.
Yeah.
I'm not this person. I'm not the performer on stage in the way that Joel is. I'm more of the speaker, host, MC person. And if I was younger, comparing myself to Joel, I would feel like, oh no, I'm not that. I'm this. And I might not have the labels for it yet. But when you're a kid, it's like, I'm more expressive versus I'm more quiet and calm. And that might be easier ways to start to differentiate introvert and extrovert, for example.
And so in Jungian terms, then it would be like once I start to individuate, once I start to pull away from an over identity with my family, say, and I start to go, I might not be like them.
Yeah.
Like the dumbest expression or example of this is when I discovered I like spearmint gum. My mom hated spearmint. So I was like, I hate spearmint gum. And then somebody gave me a piece of spearmint gum saying that it was something else. Cause I think I actually refused spearmint gum on those bases.
Right.
And then somebody handed it to me and I started chewing it. I was like, wow, what's this flavor? And they were like, it's spearmint. And I'm like, oh, what?
I thought I didn't like it.
I thought I hated spearmint. I think I was like 11-ish.
Yeah.
And so that was my process of going, I must be different. So what I'm hearing you say is growing up is like all of those moments when you're like, I'm actually my own person. Right. And then now, now I have responsibility to be my own person.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We're getting really abstract, which is great.
Really? I thought my spearmint gum really brought it down to concrete terms, Joel.
We're getting abstract in I think somebody following along saying, okay, you guys are a personality hacker and you said this relates to personality type. So make that connection for me. I think there's somebody listening or watching right now that's asking for that probably as they're following along like, well, how do I make this connect?
Right.
So I would just say, I'm just going to pause at something in a real basic way.
Yeah.
What I think we're talking about here is so let's say you, Christian, as with INTP preferences.
Yeah.
In your growing up process, we all have a natural maturation process or growing up process as children into adults that happens in a physical way. But as an INTP, let's say you're more focused on the intellectual pursuits. And so you're following your intellectual curiosities, you're understanding more and more, you're taking tons of information in. And so you're quote unquote growing up intellectually.
Yep.
Even beyond just the physical, normal growing up intellectual that we all have. But maybe because of that, you've not tuned into emotions as much.
Right.
So your emotions, when you get in an emotional place, maybe you're your kids or your wife is really emotional. I'm not saying you personally. Let's just say if you didn't, I know you've done work, but let's just say that you've developed and grown up your intellectual side, but maybe the emotional side, you focus so much on the other, you haven't focused on that. And it would make sense based on his personality type preferences, right? That you're leading with accuracy, which is a thinking process in the mental cognition you're using. So you're going to double down on intellectual pursuits, most likely. You're going to have a tendency to neglect or just not put weight or importance on the emotional stuff. And so now this is going to sneak up in your life and you're like, oh, I guess I need to grow up in this area a little bit more. I need to mature in this area. So I think this is how it relates to our type is we're going to probably find a way in a place in our life that we're overrepresented and then a place where we're underrepresented in our growth process. Is that what we're actually talking about tangibly?
Yeah, exactly. Because like when I was a kid, I always felt like I was an observer. I always felt like I was a camera. I was just like looking at the world and I was like, I felt like I came into this with some sort of a blank slate. And I'm just like writing code as I'm observing things and trying to understand it myself. I felt less inclined to ask people for help. I felt less inclined to ask people to tell me how things worked. I felt like I just was always trying to figure out how this life thing happened myself. Yeah. And by that token, I assumed that others always knew what to do. Like they just knew how to relate to each other. You know, it was very quick. It felt for me to realize that I'm not that. Like it felt like most people were just like relating with each other easier. Like, you know, I was like 8 years old and kids are already starting to like date each other and like have these little holding hands things. And I'm like, what is that? Like none of that makes any sense. So like there's so much differentiation that I felt from a pretty young age. And I think a lot of people who come through Personality Hacker probably had similar experiences of having something delineate themselves from others and felt a little bit like a weirdo or a misfit, especially as intuitives too.
Yeah. So I think a way to relate this to type very easily is if you understand your type preferences, which are the mental processes or the cognitive functions that you prefer. We talk about this in the CAR model. So if you are new to type, please feel free to look up podcast episodes on the CAR model that really helps describe what these mental processes could be. But whatever your preferred functions are, the trend is going to be that because those are so interesting and you're so tuned into those preferences, when we clock hours in something, we just naturally tend to get better at it, right? We tend to grow as a general rule. It's like related to Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. You know, you start clocking hours doing something and you start to get better and better in your performance at it. Yeah. So when we have type preferences, what we're doing is we're like watching ourselves be hyper focused on certain areas of life and just clock hours, fascinated by them, doing things related to them, you know, pursuing more information or action according to those. And those things are going to more likely naturally grow. Now, the caveat is if you're in a context that's hostile to your type preferences, if you're in a context that's hostile to them, you're going to want to grow. You're going to keep trying to smuggle it in. And you might actually, unfortunately, be less sort of have a lot less space to develop those, and that context that's hostile to your type preferences might actually force you to grow things that aren't native to you, which, you know, there's a cost benefit to both of those things. It's unfortunate because you don't get to show up as yourself. Right. But you're probably clocking hours doing something that wouldn't be natural to you. And so you might be able to develop some aspects of your personality and grow them that would have been a harder pull later on anyway. Right. So the advantage is that now you don't have to do that later as much. The disadvantage is you don't know who you are as much, right? And you feel like weird in your own skin. And so then you have to grow into those. So that can happen. But as a general rule, unless the family we grew up in or whatever socialization we have, if those aren't hostile to our type preferences, then the trend is going to be that our natural grow up, is probably going to be weighted to those type preferences. And so we'll watch ourselves very easily like, oh yeah, I think I did get better at this thing. And that is, that's the organic growth process.
Right. And I think naturally as we grow up, like when we're younger, especially, there's many of these developmental models that I've talked about, we're about to talk about, that I've talked about personally, that we've had conversations around, start from this place of being more me-centric. And I think you notice it with children, like they're playing along, they're fitting in with the family. They have to do it for survival purposes. And we had to do it for survival purposes. But it's always about like, how am I different than other people? How am I fitting into the world? What can I do? What are my skills? What are my capabilities? And it's really about learning your capacities and intelligences. In a way, it's like learning what your dominant function is and trying to grow that naturally and unconsciously with unconscious competence is like developing your specialized intelligence in that area and figuring out what your capacity is. It's like, what does this rub up against in the outside world? Where are the limits? Sometimes that's our parents, sometimes that's school, sometimes that's other kids, etc. So I wanted to kind of start with introducing the loose idea of these developmental model frameworks, which all touch on these kind of 4 key areas that I love the way that Rob Bell mentions it on one of his podcast episodes. He titled it Me, We, Everybody. And it's kind of like, these are the shifts and frames that we tend to make as we start to develop. For a long time, we're very me-centric, me-focused, and not by any sort of like selfish endeavor in terms of judgment. Selfish is actually more of a we judgment, funny enough, that we get, develop later. We go through like a religion, or we start to get more civilized, and we make those judgments of people being more selfish. Or if you have, if your desire to support myself relies on other people, you may be more quick to judge people of being selfish because that actually gets in the way of getting my needs met. Right. So that kind of messes with that paradox.
You're talking about like a radical me though. You're talking about like, I need to eat lunch, and I'm not being selfish because I need to eat lunch. I need to take care of me.
Right.
I need to do basic things to take care of myself.
Right.
And those are natural things to do, like eating, bathing, caretaking, etc.
It's basic needs. It's like Maslow's hierarchy: safety and security, survival needs. And it's, going through love and affection. Like how do I get love and affection from my caregivers? And then like, how do I get what I want? How do I start to then develop self-esteem and start to develop confidence? And how do I navigate the world beyond my house, beyond my family, beyond who I'm surrounded by, and then we move into this we-centric space, which is sometimes called ethnocentric, which is more of just like nation, country, who we're surrounded by, we're looking at different patterns or markers for like where I belong or where I fit in. It could be by skill set. It could be sometimes racially, which is why we get a lot of ethnocentric extremes of loyalties throughout the world. Right. And it could be religion. It could be, we believe the same things. It could be that we, are waving the same flag, that kind of thing. And then moving into an everybody centric, where we're starting to think about what are people like as individuals outside of this we frame, outside of religion, outside of nation, multiple nations, international culture, just trying to rationally understand what people are like. And then kind of the everything frame is like looking at sentient life, which gets into like much later worldview stuff. But I included everything because I think that's eventually what comes online when people get to kind of more of a show up place that we were talking about before. So I'm just going to read this quick Ken Wilber quote, and then I know you want to say something. So it has been shown that human beings in healthy development evolve from egocentric, which is me, to ethnocentric, we, to world-centric, everybody, to cosmocentric consciousness, which is everything. Each level expands your felt sense of love and empathy to wider and wider circles of caring. Mm-hmm. So it's, I care about me. I care about who I am. I care about my own survival as an organism. I care about we, the people that I relate to, that I have connections with. I start to care about everybody. The scope just keeps expanding and expanding.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say dovetails, or it doesn't just dovetail, it's almost exactly what you just read from Ken Wilber, which is that these are phases that we need to go through. And if we miss one of them, you can tell later on. Like if a person doesn't have enough of a me time period, they're too agreeable. They're too passive of their own experience.
Right.
We have to go through a time period where we plant our flag in the ground and we know what we stand for, in order to make it so that other people don't encroach on our boundaries.
Right.
And so the me time period is actually really crucial. The we time period, I think, is when we realize that there's a limitation to how much just general, I guess, a sense of fulfillment We can get just focused on me and my boundaries and, and making sure that I'm standing up for myself.
How much I can individually assert myself and actually get what I need.
Yeah.
Like I need to cooperate with people at some point.
Yeah. And it's not just in order to get the basic resources, but also to get a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment, right? Like there's a need to find out where I fit in all of this and where's my place in a bigger picture.
Right.
That bigger picture thinking starts to come online and realize that like, I do want to be a part of a group in some way, right? Like me just damning the man and being an anarchist only gets so far before I'm like, what was it like? Oh, I became the man, right? But there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for being in that we frame.
And just, I want to stop there because I had a moment of this yesterday because I think it's different than everybody. And I just want to really land this.
Yeah.
We were going to record yesterday or the podcast with you. And you and Antonia and myself were having a really hard day. We've been we've been running a lot, doing a lot of things. And we were just like, man, we were having a hard time getting into the recording process. And I think in the past, I've found ways to muscle through. I just couldn't do it yesterday. And Christian stepped up to kind of offer some support to us, emotional, psychological, and like friendship support in that moment, encouragement. And it was a clear moment of a me that had a limit. I needed support from others. And it's not like the everybody part, which is like an output to other, like a larger, broader community.
Yeah.
It was more of a we of like a small group, a small
personality hacker.
Exactly. Collective. And I so appreciate, I had this aha, like I can't do this alone. I have to have other people involved to support and to guide and to encourage, just like I need to support and guide and encourage people around me. So it was a really profound experience yesterday. I realized the limits of the me. Like there's so many people that are individually focused like myself, but I can't do it alone.
Yeah. And these are things that like, as we're developing and we sort of unlock, like if we go from me as a teenager and you go to college and suddenly you start to experience you start to experience a collective of maybe the skills you want to develop and where you want to go, or like sometimes colleges become a we for a lot of people. Like college football is huge in America because there's a very we experience that's connected to college for a lot of people, right? So it's not just religion, which it tends to get focused on, but it can be religion. It can be a job that you spend a lot of time in around this time period, or some sort of banner that you fly. Like, the we space loves a flag.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting watching Joel's son Gunnar go through this because he's, traditionally been he's been this teenage kid on the streets of Baltimore.
Yeah.
Right. Like just trying to survive, which put him in a very me time period. And now he's here and he's kind of getting serious about life. And now he's working full time at a local company here in Pennsylvania called Sheets. And I mean, it's not like he loves his job, but he enjoys it and he likes being there. But you can tell that he's moving into this we time period because he's like, man, it's a really good company. And like he's got all this glowing praise for, it's like basically gas stations and convenience stores, but it's a good one, right? It's a solid company that pays well and gives you upward mobility. And they've already communicated to him as he ages that they want to work with him to become a team lead. And he's excited about the process. And man, I was just watching him move on into we around a company and I couldn't be happier, right? And I think that, like you said, it can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And it usually happens around that teenage period.
So I interrupted you as you were going through this just to inject that story. I didn't mean to derail. You were on a run to go from me, we to everybody.
I was about to segue.
Continue.
I was going to do it. I was going to do it so elegantly, but that's okay. A tee up is fine too.
Yeah.
So then the next phase of the everyone, if you don't go through the we, you don't know yourself in the context of being part of something bigger. So you're actually missing aspects of your identity. Your relationship to yourself includes the relationship you have to others during that process. So then when you go back to a time period where like you're looking at everybody becomes like not just a part of a collective, but like individual players. But you have to understand how individual players look when they're a part of a collective. Like you have to have that piece of information. It's crucial in order to understand a bigger picture of a human.
Right.
So you can't skip the step. You can't go from me to everybody.
Right.
You have to go through we. And so I think the one thing that I wanted to just reiterate at this point is that each one of these phases comes with its own insight and understanding and relationship to a bigger growing relationship to self. And it's not intended to skip steps, and no no level is inherently better or worse than any other level.
Yeah.
Unless it's reached a shelf life.
Right.
Unless you need to move on to the next. And
right.
for some reason you're throttling yourself. But that's what grow up's all about, is not throttling.
Yeah. And there are multiple ways to look at this process. I mean, you could look at the word everybody, and that feels like more we, right? Is it we plus? And it's like it's not quite the case. It's like, it's starting to understand that everybody is a collection of individuals. So you're breaking out of the we space of like this tight container of like, the only people that are my people are good people and other people are bad people. It starts to expand that frame to starting to go forward individually, to start meeting other individuals. And like, how does that eventually add up to kind of a us frame versus a we frame in a sense?
Yeah. And I'm realizing it's a little bit of a grouping here. Like, I notice that I tend to land in the me and in the everybody, but the we is not as represented. And I just thought there's a relationship to the me and everybody. It's more of we're all a big collection of individuals, and I skip past the we part. And then I get into this dynamic where it's me and the rest of everyone else, this giant collective.
Yeah.
It's almost like literally sometimes I'm on a stage talking to a crowd, an audience.
Right.
But that's me. It's not really a dynamic of a we with like a group of people. Like, it's just still like two sides to something. It's like two individuals. It's a collective individual and me.
Right.
And I skip past the we, and that's what I got that profound experience with yesterday. And I bet the we and the consciousness frame is also something that people have a proclivity to. Because I think in terms of like, let's say there's an INFJ listening right now who's all about the we. So much so they don't even have an identity. They don't have They don't have a sense of what they want, maybe, or they don't have a good boundary setting frame. They're so focused on the collective and let's do this all together, which I need to get more of, but they probably need to lean more into like the me part of it.
Right.
Right. In that side. So I kind of see these things clustering a little bit, and we probably have a preference for one or the other, I would.
Yeah. And I think especially as we get to the everybody space, and this is overarching representative of multiple models to get into the granular, but as we get into an everybody space, it's really easy to want to abandon one of the earlier ones. Like, what I love about Ken Wilber's work and the integral theory, and what I've extracted that applies to these other things, is this idea of transcend and include.
Yes.
If you're taking a simple framework like the stages of development, which you guys have done podcasts on with talking about Erik Erikson's model of talking about childhood and young adulthood, midlife and elderhood, it's like, as you become older, you're not abandoning things that you've learned in childhood or young adulthood. You carry those things with you. That's part of collecting experience points, is you don't abandon the experience when you get to a level or get to the next stage of your life. You're bringing those things with you. So in the everybody space, it's really easy to look back in disdain at like the we space that I just came from. Maybe it's like a religion that was awful to me, or like something that I had some sort of trouble with. Like, a lot of people will, in America, for example, will see the way things are politically right now, getting into an everybody space and like, being patriotic is, I don't want to do that. There's like this disdain towards where you've come from, or disdain towards your family. And that represents an aspect of your me space, or ignoring, like with personality life path, there's a lot of stuff that comes up around introverted sensing memory that has a lot of relationship to the me space.
Yes.
To the environment that you grew up around, or the we collective. So, there's this challenge of being able to integrate because of trauma, but sometimes letting go because of this maybe hubris, that thinking about the world at large is more important than thinking about the we or the me in that sense.
So I think what would be valuable now, and you already introduced one of them casually, but we probably don't have time to go into every single like depth of them.
Yeah.
But we can do a survey or an index of some of the meta models or some of the frameworks of growth.
Yeah.
Inside the grow up framework, right? So let's talk through some of these and maybe give people reference to go learn more, because we can't go into every single one deep. Then you can slow us down. If there's one you want to put more attention to, we can start to focus on that.
I think what I wanted to do is differentiate between these different models, like what really stands out as like why you might want to dive into one of these. And really it's the me, we, everybody, and everything was this sort of overarching that I think all of these have in common. Childhood is the me space. Young adulthood tends to be the we space. Midlife tends to be more everybody, and elderhood is kind of everything if things are going well,
Yeah.
so to speak.
If there's not arrested development.
If there's not arrested development, which could happen for varying numbers of reasons,
Yeah.
you know, or things that you're missing that you did not transcend and include from your past, right? So we did mention the stages of development, and you've done a thorough deep dive on that on the podcast. It is called Stages of Development. I'll do the whole lower third thing. You can put it right here. That'd be great.
Note to self.
Note to self.
Editing note while you're making the podcast.
And that's an important one. I think what stands out about that is the idea that you talked about adulting. It's like midlife is a relatively new idea for us to really be diving deep into.
Yeah.
You know, like the life expectancy age is going up dramatically.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like there's a lot less research as to like what it means to have a fulfilling life in midlife, to have a fulfilling life in elderhood, and to bring those younger aspects of ourselves into it. Like, how do we still play as someone who has a lot of responsibility and is in between childhood and elderhood? Like how do you bring that aspects into yourself? So that model, I think, is really helpful for that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I want to reference the levels of awareness from Beatrice Chestnut and Aranio Pius. They do a lot of great work around the Enneagram, and it talks about conscious awareness. They use the Enneagram as a symbol to help navigate levels of consciousness. So it's like you're asleep at the one point, and then something happens and you go through a wake up period and start to become more lucid about your growing up experience. So that's another way to kind of navigate this growing up experience. Claire Graves, probably one of the most popular, or at least the most, I say Spiral Dynamics is probably the most popular, but Claire Graves spawned that. Mm-hmm. He calls it levels of development. There's a really great interview on YouTube with Claire Graves and Don Beck and Christopher Cowan from like the 70s or 80s. That is one of the coolest things I watched when I was really getting into this. And he did a lot of psychological work traveling around and asking people, what is the meaning of life? Mm-hmm. And saw that there were just different answers emerging, and started to take this more psychological approach of understanding people's answers to that question. And from that spawned Spiral Dynamics, where Don Beck and Christopher Cowan took that and started to apply values and circumstances to that idea, meaning that he calls each level a value meme. It's like the same kind of they're similar developmental ideas, even though people have different circumstances
or opinions,
right? Or opinions about what that means, right? So when you're in a me space, everything is about me. Everything is about what I want, how I'm asserting myself. Mm-hmm. When you're in a we space, it's like what is most important for the collective, or maybe a hyper focus on like moral intelligence. And then in an everybody space, it's like, you know, what's good for people at large, or how do we understand the world from like more of a materialist or spiritual place.
An example of people having the same values at the same level but different opinions mm-hmm. is you'll hear people, you know, they'll say things in this culture like, well, the left and the right are exactly, you know, they're the same. Mm-hmm. And then people will go, no, they're not the same. And I oftentimes see that argument as the one person is saying that they're on the same level of values, meaning mm-hmm. that they might have different opinions on how to make those values happen, but they're agreeing on the values, right? Meaning that like all of us need to collectively get together and make a change. That's a value, right? The value that all of us get together and make a change is the value. Right. But the opinion on how to do that might differ. Mm-hmm. And so when you're seeing people assert, you know, they call them like equivalences or whatever, like it's not the equivalent, but when the accusation is that both sides are the same and no matter what you're talking about, right? What they're usually saying is that they're occupying the same level of values development. Right. And then the person will go, no, they're not the same. And then they go, but if you zoom in on that level of value of development, they're very different about their opinions on how to go about it and different on their outcome. Right.
It's like the desire is the same. The desire is maybe for civility, and how do we operate as a civilization? Right. How do we, you know, enable people to enter the quote unquote system of society to fit into a role? And how have some people maybe been abandoned, or how do we not abandon people who have already fit into it? You know, it's all the same desire of keeping society running optimally for as many people as possible. But in terms of the we space, it's usually a favoritism towards my we. I want my we to be able to have a better society, right?
Of course.
So that's the difference.
And when you're occupying the same level of consciousness or the same values level of development, you're not always aware that the other person that is on the other side of the argument is also occupying that same space.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that, or at least my observation, I don't know if it's fascinating, but my observation is that we almost only fight with people who are at our same level of development.
Yeah.
Because we see them, right? We can resonate at the same sort of channel.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the arguments happen. So if you're arguing with somebody and you find somebody to be kind of your nemesis or constantly on the other side and you're battling each other, you're probably occupying the same level of development.
And I just want to make sure somebody understands what you're saying. Somebody will zoom in on the topic and say, no, it's very different. They think about this in the topic. You're not talking about topic. You're talking about arena.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the idea of like, if you're really strongly religious and you have a really strong faith background, you have this moment where you're like, wait a minute, I don't believe this anymore. Instead of transcending that and going maybe toward something else, you go, now I'm going to go and I'm going to oppose the very religion I was a part of.
Yep.
And somebody would say, see, I'm not that anymore. That's that over there. It's like, but you're still in the same arena. You're still affected by it. You're just countering it now.
Right.
You're on the opposite side of it. So that's what you're saying is the opposing side of some issue or something. You're both still in the framework of that itself.
Or the battling of religious ideas,
Correct.
or the battling of political ideas, or the battling.
Those are the arenas.
Those are the arenas, and you're only ever going to battle somebody who's in the same arena with you.
And a person that's mired in that has a hard time understanding that there's a level beyond that. There's a perspective that goes beyond that arena.
Yep.
Right.
And I was there too. And I think, I still am there in a lot of ways in certain aspects of my life.
It still exists within us. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there's topics that I am absolutely there, but I think that's what you're speaking to, just to give a clarity of how that looks in a real pragmatic way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so to route back to the point of origin when we were originally talking about it, which was remind me what you were originally talking about.
We were talking about me, we, and everybody relative to spiral dynamics and value memes and things like that.
Right. Right.
Values and circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's sometimes easier to diagnose where a person's at based on their opponents. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of this idea of we can't really see where we are.
Yeah.
We are where we are. We can't necessarily always, like, we can't see the seer. We can't see ourselves unless we look into a mirror. So most of the time when you're having arguments online, for example, with someone who represents the same level, it's like that's being reflected back to you. Can't really see it unless it happens back to you.
Yeah. It's like being assigned by weight class.
Well,
in a way, yeah.
And sometimes people can't even take that position unless they have the opposition to it.
Yeah. Right.
But that gives them the ability to take the position they have.
Right.
They need the opposite.
Right.
And I think there's another way of thinking beyond that, but it's like you almost have to have it. If I don't have the enemy to combat.
And most of the time with the we space in particular, anytime there's like an us versus them frame that comes up naturally within us, that's us representing a we space of some kind. Again, it could be like country, nation, race, ethnicity, any number of those things that we have this like kind of we attachment to that comes up all the time. And a lot of the criticisms in the zeitgeist are around our relationship to a we-centric space.
Yeah, that's actually why I said what I was going to say, or what I did say is we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that's a very valid growth development place. And then we need to, like you mentioned, integrate and transcend, and you can talk about the next phase of that.
Yeah.
But there is something to be said for patriotism. There is something, in fact, earlier you're like talking about INTP being better than ENFP.
Yeah.
Isabel Briggs Myers called it type patriotism, and we all kind of have it.
Yeah.
And in some ways we should, because what we're doing is we're validating our experience.
Right.
We're going like, actually, it's really good to have ENTP preferences. That's a good thing.
Right.
In fact, I wouldn't change it.
Right.
And so there's something to be said for patriotism living on inside in multiple different arenas.
Right.
And I mean, the one way that I see this come up is like people always argue that their nation has better beer.
Right.
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 It's like we have all these microbrews here, so obviously we have better beer. And the Germans would be like, no.
Hold my beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I don't understand personally why someone would grow up in California and be a Yankees fan. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, but I understand that maybe part of their we-centric experience, like there's the Yankees, for example, were a national sort of national phenomenon.
Win a lot. I mean, I could see it.
Dallas Cowboys in like what was the 80s and 90s were very popular, like maybe shown on national TV.
Yes.
Whatever was shown on national TV would, somebody could find that as their favorite team, maybe if their state wasn't represented. Right. But for me, like I grew up in Philadelphia. All the Philly teams, sports teams are my thing. Like everybody else can go screw off. Right. Like, and the Phillies just lost their opportunity to get to the World Series last night. So I'm still very distraught about that. Right. So that's very we centric. I go to Philly and I go to a baseball game. I feel this collective we centric relationship. I don't bring that with me all the time. I keep moving forward. I have other ways that I still think about the world at large. And I think about ourselves as individuals, developing individual resource and things like that. But if I were to abandon that, there would be this hollowness inside of me.
Yeah.
And I understand that there's pain for a lot of people's we-centric experiences, but I think it's a really valuable aspect. Like you don't have to run around saying that you're, waving the American flag and all of that stuff, but at least like some sense of gratitude for where you came from, I think is valuable to integrate.
Yeah. So to route it back to the conversation about like somebody's like, how is patriotism part of growing up? But, or being into the Eagles or whatever.
Yeah.
The Eagles.
Yeah.
I think what we're talking
Eagles, Eagles.
That's right.
Yep.
I think the reason why we're discussing these levels of development and all of these different models is they're references for how to, they're like guide rails for growing up, accelerating one's maturity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a reminder to not reject where you've come from, the previous levels, because true growth means integrating the lessons of previous levels.
Yeah.
And so you can't actually grow up if every time you have an awareness change and you start to go, oh, there's a bigger world at play here. You go, well, everything I knew before is wrong.
Yeah.
You throw it all away, or anybody who thinks that way is wrong. You want to grab all of those lessons, integrate them and include them as you're heading up levels of consciousness.
Well, and also you can't really get rid of them as much as you think you can.
Yes, they get smuggled.
Because it's part of your experience. It just, all you're doing is making it unconscious, which becomes part of the cleanup work that we'll talk about in a future episode.
Right.
So you've got a couple of great episodes about spiral dynamics. You've talked about the stratification, which is the idea of circumstances that if our life circumstances are not ideal, we can kind of fall back a little bit into a previous worldview that we need to access in order to navigate forward. Like if my car gets impounded for some reason, I have to navigate the world in much more of a nomad kind of way. I have to figure out how to get to where I'm going and reconnect myself to civilization somehow. Like that, it's almost that worldview is like dragging me down to say like, you didn't deal with this, so you have to deal with this. And then there are times where we have peak experiences and we have a little bit of a lucidity of like the next stage of development. So generally, if you're trying to diagnose a sense of where you are, first of all, have a lot of modesty. And then second of all, typically where you have some sort of disdain or frustration with is where you've come from, what you can look back on. It's like a little kid that like you have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, which is what I have. And the 11-year-old looks back at the 8-year-old. It's like, why are you being such a child? Like that kind of thing. We do that on bigger scales. Why are you being a criminal? Why are you being so fundamentalist about this? Like, why are you being so hyper rational about this? You're capitalist or whatever, right? We have these different judgments of those areas. And then we tend to look forward in a little bit of fear because it's the unknown territory. It creates a little bit of anxiety of like, what are their intentions? What are they doing? And you can almost tell that they have a little bit more freedom or a little bit more ability to move beyond where you are. So that incites a little bit of fear. So that kind of covers the generals of spiral dynamics. And I would just search amongst Personality Hacker for a couple of episodes that you guys have done about that.
Yeah, I think going back to the topic of growing up, not just the models that help one get there.
Yeah.
So thank you, by the way, for providing those resources.
We have a few more here I think you wanted to mention as well.
There's 2 more, but go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Well, I was going to go sort of back to what growing up actually means.
Yeah.
Right. Regardless of which models you use to help assess and figure that out. So why don't you complete the list?
Why don't just quickly, because like spiral dynamics is probably the thickest, most popular one, right? So the last 2 is integral theory, which is Ken Wilber's version of spiral dynamics, essentially, but he touches more on levels of consciousness, levels of conscious awareness, and it tends to be used in more of a social political sense. Like they tend to talk about it in like bigger scales kind of way, which I think is interesting. And then it's quickly becoming my favorite and one of the newest ones, created by Terry O'Fallon, called the Stages model, which is a much more granular look at something like spiral dynamics or integral theory. It's that same sort of spiral development look. But she essentially focuses on what's called person perspective. That's kind of extracted from Ken Wilber's work, which is like we're growing and developing. When we're in the me-centric phase, we take a first person perspective. We're looking at the world as if we are the only subject and everything else is the object. And then a second person is like, there's other people that have conscious awareness and I have to kind of cooperate with them. It's like when kids start to get into sharing, or theory of mind, or a third person perspective where it's not just me and you, but there's a we here. What is the we, right? That gets into the we space, and so on and so forth. Asking three main questions of like, is the subject of awareness, of my awareness, concrete, subtle, or meta-aware, which is like awareness of awareness. And that gets into some interesting stuff there. The second question is the expression of the person individual or collective, which we've talked about. You know, that idea is someone focused individually or collective or interior or exterior. And then lastly, is the experience receptive, active, reciprocal, or interpenetrative, which is kind of this idea of, you almost think of high school has these 4 levels. You've got freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, and each has its own archetypal behavior as a result of going through these different levels. Like freshman is new territory. It's wide-eyed. It's bushy-tailed. I have this idealism, but I'm going to get quickly swatted down by the people who are superior in this level. Sophomores, they start to think they know better. So there's a little bit of a hubristic nature to it. This sort of reciprocal junior area is like, okay, I can start to actually contribute to the bigger whole of the high school and get involved in more events and stuff like that. And then interpenetrative is like this senioritis of like, I've been here for a while. I know how this all works and I can navigate all of this with ease.
But I'm ready to go.
But I'm ready to move on to the next stage also and have a new freshman experience. Right. So the stages model is really interesting for that sort of deep dive into those granular nuance. And she was a teacher for 50 years. So she brings a lot of childhood development nuance into it as well.
I love that. Let's put the link in the show notes or somewhere below the episode.
Stagesinternational.com.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, thank you for the resources. So, okay, so a person might go, okay, thanks for all of these models that I now have to spend hours and hours of like going and checking out. So but I thought we were talking about growing up. So what do you mean by that? Yeah. And so I think we should just do a little bit of conversation around what growing up really means in this model. What does it mean to truly grow up? Not to just like watch yourself go through different levels of development based on hierarchical perspectives, but like what is actually growing up?
Is it active? Is it passive? Is it something we do? Like let's start there maybe. What is it? Like?
I mean, it's kind of what we talked about at the top, right? It's this idea of identifying, first of all, the fact that like, what are you unconscious around in terms of like growing up, and what are you now becoming conscious around? So it's like, what am I using Myers-Briggs for? What am I trying to grow around? What am I trying to learn and develop? Is it something that I need help with interior world stuff or exterior world stuff, or a little bit of both? Ken Wilber has this quote also: to grow up means to level up your consciousness. Your level of consciousness is the set of organizing principles that form your worldview, right? So like, what are some of the principles that you're surrounded by and living your life by, and how can those continue to evolve? So I think growing up is that sort of space where it's like identifying what I've already been doing, because you can't redo that. What has led to who I am now. That's why talking about integrating the we-centric part is important, because it's already in there. You're either going to act it out unconsciously or consciously, right? So seeking out what you're becoming conscious around, so that can actually like almost illuminate and start to propel your growth going forward, right? So growth in that sense means continuing to develop conscious awareness around more and more areas of your life.
Yeah. So 2 things that are coming up for me. The first one is that I'm glad that you mentioned the work of Erik Erikson, and then you talked about midlife as well, because Erickson is probably one of the most influential voices in early childhood development. Even though his work was like quite a while ago, it's like the foundation that a lot of early childhood development work is built on top of.
Yeah.
But the one thing that really hasn't been touched on, even Erickson does a little tiny bit, but not as much. He was focused on the earlier phases. But Carl Jung is one of the few people to have really focused on, and you mentioned before, which is midlife, midlife and elderhood. And the reason why I think that's so important, particularly in this topic of grow up, is that we get this sense, we hear this, the best information we have is that our brains are fully formed around 25 years old. Mm-hmm. And so we go, oh, that must mean that I'm not going to grow it past that. Mm-hmm. So what I've learned at 25 is what I might take in more information, but I'm not really making any significant growth changes.
Right. I'm done.
I'm done for the most part. So, then I set myself up for life and I get a job and I, if I want to, I partner up or, and then I have children if that's a thing I want to do and blah, blah, blah. And then that's the rest of my life.
And I'm going to sit in my lazy boy until 65.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or watch my stories after work or, whatever. Mm-hmm. Or I might really super be into personal growth and development and personality types. And that's the thing I occupy my mind with. Right. But it's more of like an occupation of the mind as opposed to a real
embodiment,
rewiring.
Keep yourself busy with it.
Yeah. It's like, oh, this is what I'm going to spend my time doing. Mm-hmm. And Jung addressed midlife as almost like there are unique new developmental opportunities, almost kind of like you can try to potty train your kid at 2, but there's going to be lots of accidents. Mm-hmm. If you just wait until like they're 3, right, 4, then you're not going to have as many accidents because they're kind of ready for it.
Right.
He mentioned that there are developmental opportunities that you can try to do earlier, but you're going to not get it right. And you're going to have quote unquote lots of accidents.
Right.
If you start doing it when your brain is ready and your mind is ready for it, you're going to have a lot more success and much faster. And midlife is an opportunity. He mentions, and I agree, midlife starts opening up new circuits, things that you did not have available when you were younger.
Right.
So growing up, I think it's important to reinforce the idea that growing up isn't something that you do the bulk of when you're young, and then it's just a matter of seasoning after that, right? Or maintenance.
Yeah.
Growing up, I think I think it indicates or is validated by some of this work that you're going to have peak moments of growing up all throughout your life, right? There's like different opportunities that come up at different time periods as you age,
right, that
just weren't available when you were younger.
Right.
And so growing up means being tuned in to these opportunities of going, like they almost feel like 0 to 1 moments, right? It's like, oh, I didn't know that I didn't know that I could see things that way.
Right.
We talk about how our 30s feel so different than our 20s.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like I spent my 30s cleaning up my 20s. And now I'm in my 40s. I'm like, this is a totally different ball of wax than my 30s was. Right. And I assume that this is just going to keep going. So growing up means understanding that it's not just keeping a plate spinning after a certain time.
Yeah.
It's like actually continuing to develop and grow up and understand bigger and bigger levels of consciousness all throughout your life.
And I think continually asking the question, what am I ready for?
Yes.
That really stuck out to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have an example of this. Again, I'm trying to land this in a real way for somebody that's listening or watching right now. Like what's a personal example of how this might look? Okay. So, and we're probably going to go in this in the next few episodes. We talk about wake up, clean up, and show up.
Yep.
There might be some elements I'm dipping into wake up and clean up here as I talk about it. But okay, so I think there's like, I think grow up comes from a couple things like pressure. Like you realize you need to do something to, like you're being pressured towards something. So we have evolutionary pressures as we grow up naturally, like obviously we're drawn toward mating and like
biological
pressure, right? But like, so we had this experience recently at our personality life path program. We were doing a lot of intellectualized coaching, a lot of like cerebral conversation, much like the podcast.
Yeah.
At the last PLP in the actual live event, there were a few people there that needed a little bit more emotional work, and more visceral body work.
Kinesthetic work.
And I remember at least 2 people I stepped in a profound way from my experience with my physicality. I brought them into a space where we're doing role playing, we're acting things out, we're emoting with our physicality and our vocalizations. It doesn't look like intellectualizing anything. Like there wasn't a lot of articulation happening. There was a lot of performative type work. And in that moment, I realized, oh, this is a really key, important part of some of the work we're going to do in the future that I was contributing to. And I'm like, my body, I am so immature in how I've taking care of myself physically. Like, I'm fairly healthy. I don't eat terribly, but I certainly don't attune my body in a way that would be prepared to do really high level personal growth work with somebody at a workshop for multiple days. Like, I can only do a couple of those. I'd probably wear out. I was really exhausted after this last one.
Right.
And so it was awareness to me, and we'll probably talk about this in the next episode, Wake Up.
Yeah.
I had this moment where I woke up to, oh man, my body, my physicality, my voice, my emotions, and all the attunement to that. It's not just up here. It's all of it. Wow, I've been immature. Wow, I need to grow up in this way. I need to get attuned to that. I need to actually take that serious.
Well, and if you're asking yourself that question of like, what am I ready for?
I'm ready for that.
You're ready to grow up in that area.
Yeah. But I didn't know that until I had the pressure of a real experience. I was trying to coach people. Oh, well, I did coach. We did workshop with folks like in live dynamic. And I thought I mean, I don't know if you guys agree. I think it went really well. We were able to make some shifts emotionally for people.
Right.
But I think the pressure of having to perform there, I realized by testing myself, by testing my mettle, I was like, oh, that's an area that I need to shore up better.
Yeah. And I know what you mean by the pressure aspect, because I think we take for granted that, like, we assume that we just grow up always naturally. Like, it's just like, this is just the next stage that I just kind of wander into when there's a show called Hoarders, which is basically about people who have hoarding disorder, and they collect and keep too many things. And there's a couple different reasons. Like, spiral development is a really good observation to make when watching that show, because people have different reasons for why they have hoarding disorder, and you can observe that. But one of those reasons, it's people tend to either get in some sort of arrested development. I've seen situations where they were in early development, like very young, or in a circumstance where they didn't have social pressure to push them through development, because sometimes our parents provide social pressure to help us develop and grow, and we have adverse reactions to that. Or like in Hoarders, there are a couple episodes where like family members have passed away, and they didn't learn proper hygiene relative to civility and things like that. Yeah. So they become developmentally stunted, and it's not that they're like being they're being rebellious and creating this hoarding situation. There's like literally not enough pressure for them to move to the next stage.
Yes.
For Gunnar to be able to move to the next stage, he needs pressure to stop doing what he was doing before and do the next thing, as much as including him being ready for it.
Yeah.
You know, like, you needed the circumstance, the little bit of the social pressure of like, we need to actually get through this. We need to provide good value for our clients, for our students. And, you know, that moment probably also hits you in that sense too. Yeah. It's like, we're not getting this done here. And so I need to step into something I've never done before, or that I'm not used to doing, or that I didn't realize I was ready for. So I just took the leap and I do it. And from there, being able to assess, you know, if you're ready for the next thing.
Right. So sometimes growing up, because it requires a readiness and a level of pressure, oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, I think that actually might just be sort of the algorithm.
It might be what it is.
Yeah. It might be the equation is I'm ready for it, and I'm also getting pressure to do so.
Yep.
When we do personal growth work, which is a version of growing up, right? When we do personal growth work and we try to take it upon ourselves to curate the experience, I think sometimes we jump the gun and we hope we're ready for something that is actually beyond us. And we don't always put ourselves in enough of a pressured situation to do it. So we're not ready for it, and we're not feeling pressure, and yet we still want to be able to do it a little too early, almost like a little too early.
Right.
I think personal growth work, when a person starts to craft, you know, if this is going to become part of your life, if this is the thing you're going to do, I think on some level you have to allow it to guide you too, right? You have to allow, like, what is going on in my life right now might not be concurrent with the work I want to be doing, but what's going on in my life right now is a lot more relevant and a lot better opportunities for growth than the thing I want it to be.
Right.
And so I think all of us should feel pressure to do more with our health and our body and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it's usually when you have a scare that you start getting serious about it.
Right.
Or when you have a situation where you're like, I'm going to need to have a lot more energy for these experiences. I'm going to need to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a piece of it, is growing up is also not wanting to skip steps. Growing up is being modest, right? And having a modest assessment of where you're at, what life is providing for you, what you're ready for, and then meeting it where it's at. And then you don't have those spiritual bypasses, right? But I want to be better here. And so I'm going to jump ship and just do that. I think it requires a soberness of you are here dot.
Okay. This is great.
Okay.
Great framework. I love the meta frame, but let's get more tangible. Do you have?
How am I never tangible?
Well, what I mean is,
I'm trying to bring it down.
Personal. Maybe it's personal. No, I think we have to have that understanding, but also I want. That's the understanding of it, the cerebral. Well, or what in your own life, like what is something that you would say that you are focused? Like I said, for me, I think it's the physical. It's not so much I need to grow up like I'm not clumsy. It's more just I need to take care of my body because it's my instrument for giving and contributing.
Right.
And I've been very aware of that. And I also do better thinking when I'm up and moving and I can like vocalize things. I'm like, man, I'm using, I'm not using myself at my full capacity to serve other people. And there's an opportunity. So it's not necessarily I gotta fix something. There's an opportunity I want. It's more achievement focused. And I'm like, if I can dial this physicality in, I'm going to be able to serve more and more and show up more and more.
I think it's really easy for me as an INTP to avoid the pressure part. It's really easy to squirm my way intellectually around having to like show up for people or having to commit myself to something.
Well, I'm an INTP. I do the intellectual stuff. I don't show up in other ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's really easy to use personality type material as a way for me to continue to feel superior to people so that I don't have to actually engage with people or to create circumstances. I mean, there's so many things these days that are remote, they're distant, they're isolating. There's this epidemic of loneliness. People aren't really committing and connecting to each other and dating and stuff like that. It's like there's more ways than ever to squirm our way out of that pressure. I keep thinking of social pressure because my Harmony 3-year-old function is just like clamors for it, but my other parts of me will just do everything I can to avoid it.
Yeah.
So what I've needed to do, including like what I've been doing with business, like I have a podcast called Happy Chemicals, but it's me by myself. I could do it at any time. I can make any arbitrary commitment to myself whenever I want. And I just do it whenever something's interesting. But in this case, like we have to make the commitment together for me to show up with this framework to present to you, to make sure it's interesting to not only you, but to people watching, to have an impact on their lives in some shape or form, to move the needle in some sense.
Yeah.
So it requires me to think in not only a way that's like the INTP, introverted thinking, accuracy, depth, but I need to make it accessible. I need it to be emotionally impactful. I need it to be something where I actually show up and perform and not just show up and explain things.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm learning that very much in my life to show up as like almost a performer, not just an explainer, not just this is how it is mentally. And now you go do it, but like actually be a demonstration of, my own growing process as well.
Yeah. I think you're doing a great job. I think you're on the pathway there.
Appreciate that. I can feel my inner 3-year-old like, oh, I got feedback. That's awesome. Yay. Thank you.
No, I think you're doing a great job. Do you have one that's like coming up for you as like a grow up process?
Yeah. My most recent one is really resting into parenthood. Like even after having a child, there was a lot of me that resisted all of the responsibility and the consistency required in parenthood. We're all basically talking about in cognitive function terms or inferior functions or a 3-year-old in the car model. And mine is no different, right? My introverted sensing or memory function is something I've had a lot of life pressure right now to focus on, and I'm ready for it too. And so I think before I tried to be a better parent, but I always felt like I was failing.
Yeah.
Recently, I have the pressure of, we've chosen to homeschool Piper, and she's at an age where there's not, it's like half her day isn't spent coloring, right? It's not like crafts. It's like serious work. And I need to make sure.
Long division, other things.
Right. Fractions, decimals. She's in 6th grade now, right? And so it's like, it's more complicated math. And it's like, is she ready for that? And if she's not ready for it, who is the person who failed to make her ready for it? And, we're talking about a lot more complicated scientific things. We're talking about more complicated civilization things. And if she's if she's not educated in that way, I only have myself to blame because I made a choice to be the person who educates her. And that means I have to show up with a lot more consistency. So that means carving out time. In fact, fighting for the time to homeschool her. When you have your own business at home, that thing wants to.
Joel's like, come in and help me with this. You're like, I got to homeschool Piper. What are you talking about?
This business is an attention hog. It will take our attention as much as it can pull us if possible. And so going, listen, I'm going to fight. Not just I need to do this, but I have to actively fight and resist the world's attention taking to go, nope. For 4 hours a day, Piper and I are sitting right here and we're going through her education and it's a concentrated 4 hours and I'm right there with her, educating her. And this is the first year I feel like we are truly successful at that. Other times it fits and starts, it's like she knew some of the basics. So I thought I was okay. But now she's at an age where whatever she's missed before, my goodness, do I need to fill it in right now?
Yeah.
And I just wasn't, the pressure wasn't there of going, there's a window of time where, like whatever wasn't learned earlier, I have a window of time to fill in all of those spaces and then still prepare her for adulthood. Because that's, to me, parenting is, as far as I'm concerned, basically a preparation job, right? Yeah. I'm preparing her to not need me anymore over time. And so before I could fudge the numbers, but I can't fudge them anymore. So there's that pressure of, if I don't do this for her, I'm setting her up for failure as an adult. Right. That's a lot of pressure.
So you have to grow up in the process of that.
So I have to grow up and I have to really, truly, I have to do the thing I hate doing, which is be totally consistent, right? Rigorously consistent. Oh my gosh, it's such a heavy lift. And I fail again and again, but it's like, okay, we started at 9:30 instead of 9, right? And I'm like beating myself up, and I'm like, but we started, right? And so here we go. Yeah. And so, I feel like that's my grow up right now. And I think parenting provides so many pressure opportunities to grow up. I feel like, and Joel and I were talking about this before, people who aren't parents, no, I mean, no shade to anybody who's not a parent. It's not going to necessarily, it's not like, well, people who are parents grow up and people who don't have kids don't grow up.
Right.
It's just that pressure piece is missing, or at least it's not as obvious.
It gives you a great opportunity is what you're saying.
Yeah. Parenting applies a lot of pressure, consistent pressure, so that when you're not ready, it's applying that pressure and you just go, I should be doing this. I should be doing this. And then all of a sudden you are ready and the pressure is still there because parenting it turns into a diamond if we allow it to. Yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
Pressure is acted upon us all the time. Like that. There's literally pressure systems at different elevations, right? The pressure is just one of those consistent things of the universe. And I think again, where it's like easy to be so squirmy to avoid any little pressure that we could, from institutions, from social pressure, from our own experience or having experience, to continue to have those pressures applied. So I have written here that this actually transitions into perfectly was the idea that like coaching, mentors, religions, institutions, and rites of passages help us with transitions between growth stages.
Yes.
And I think that's like when we're asking what we're ready for, it's like, am I ready to move on from this kind of pressure to a new kind of pressure that will help me continue to accelerate and grow?
I just feel like I need to close the loop on that thought, because I don't want a bunch of people being like, Antonia Dodge thinks that people don't have kids are bad. No,
she does, but we're not going to say that loud.
Yeah, we're not.
That's inaccurate. That is inaccurate.
I put it very big on screen.
If you don't have children, though, you don't necessarily have a constant pressure machine.
Yeah,
that's constantly pushing on you. And so, if you do not have children, you have to find a way to replace it.
Well, you could say dependence. I mean, I used to work at the zoo, and a zookeeper is much like a parent. They can't just not have to tend to an animal that day.
Something you're responsible for.
Now there is a difference, because this, an elephant who's locked in a cage is different than a child who has their own mindset and their own viewpoints and their own personality.
Yeah, right? I don't think a lot of people are doing dogs right now, which is great. I mean, it does require you to be consistent, but I don't know if it applies the same pressure.
Yeah.
So if a person doesn't have a constant pressure machine there, like a kid, and there's plenty of parents who don't rise to the occasion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like just having kids is the key.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then you have to find a replacement for that. You have to put yourself in a situation where you experience pressure so that when you're ready, those two things align. Mm-hmm. So growing up in part is creating circumstances and an environment.
That's the principle.
An experience in life that allows you to push enough pressure through the pipe so that when you're ready to go up a level, you have the ingredients to do so.
Well, and I think your transition idea combined with her idea, it's this idea of as society solves these for us, these like biological pressures, social pressures. You don't have to go out and like meet somebody in real life. You can date on an app and kind of curate stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So some of those pressures are off. We have to purposely put them in. I think that's the principle you're trying to land.
Thank you. Yeah.
And you're saying transition. So you're saying we have to consciously put pressure into our lives to get us to grow or, like focus on it. And you're saying transitions are really key for these.
Yeah. Like being able to, like, you have to consciously make the choice to hire a coach. Or to participate in a program that's going to be accountable for you. Like people are trying to do it themselves with like apps that track their progress and stuff. But I know as an introverted thinking accuracy person that I can squirm my way out of that too. I can make a commitment to myself and ignore the commitment to myself, right? So external commitments, that's why people hire coaches. That's why they find mentors. It's why they might join a religion or a group or mastermind or something that will keep them accountable.
And I just realized it's why people say all growth happens out of your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
What they're really saying is that all growth happens under pressure.
Yeah.
Because pressure isn't comfortable.
I mean, I think we did it. I think we solved the world's problems.
Okay, done.
I agree. I like
did
it.
Did we do it in a concrete enough way, Joel?
Maybe not
No,
tally.
no, we
I
did
am
not.
talking to two NTPs, so
yeah,
I'm
we're
trying
doing
to
our best
get
here.
trying to bring you down to earth, but it's okay.
I was trying to make it more.
It's
concrete.
good enough for government work. So I think also the access point here, if you're listening or watching, I think really your personality type. I mean, we are a personality hacker at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we do see that as a way. It doesn't have to be the way to access this idea of growth, but there's so much available to you if you just tune into how you're wired.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an extrovert, the likelihood of you having to grow more introverted aspects of yourself is fairly high. Like you probably are going to have pressure in the inner space. If you're very extroverted and outwardly focused, yeah, you're probably gonna have to tune more into the self, more into the introverted space, and vice versa. If you're more introverted, you might have to go and get out there a little bit more. That's a real basic one. But so whatever level of type, that might be the only exposure to personality types that you have listening or watching right now is the introvert-extrovert framework. Mm-hmm. But there's avenues of growth there, and you can kind of see, okay, I know that about myself. So what would be an avenue of growth? I'm an extroverted person. I love being out with people. I'm always go, 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 go. Oh, I bet it's getting more still and quiet and working on finding ways to put myself in positions where I have to grow that part of myself. So it could be as basic as that. Or if you're a type geek and you know more about personality type, you've gone way down the rabbit hole and you know things like cognitive functions and archetypes and the shadow functions and all the depth that comes from a system like Myers-Briggs. I'm just choosing Myers-Briggs, by the way, not even like Enneagram or other systems. You probably have a lot more available, more nuanced, discrete ways of growing and finding ways to grow up. Mm-hmm. Like we talked about that inferior 3-year-old function, all three of us kind of had a version of our grow up experience right now is focused on that part of our psychology.
Yep.
Right. I'm focused on my physical experience and all of my disciplines and habits in that realm, which is my 3-year-old of introverted sensing or memory. You talked about the emotional, getting out there. Oh, I got to make this entertaining and show up in a performative way. That's extroverted feeling or harmony. That's your 3-year-old as an INTP. I'm an ENFP. As an ENTP, you expressed also that 3-year-old introverted sensing process of consistency.
Yeah.
So that might be an access point for you too. If you're listening and you are a little more familiar with type, look maybe at just the first 4 functions. We put it into a car model: driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, and 3-year-old. Maybe there's an avenue here. You could kind of look at your personality type to see an access point for growth in your life. I think that's what I'm always looking for, is where somebody that's listening or watching now, how can they start? How can they really think about this? Where's the starting place or the access point for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that really leads into what we're providing with Personality Hacker Quests.
Yeah.
Is this opportunity for you to move from being just a passive listener to someone who's actively engaged with the material. And like we said, like bringing personality types alive in your life. So we create these quests for you to be able to take these little journeys each week and be able to have other people that you're essentially like accountable to. I mean, you still have sovereignty to choose to show up or not. But like if you're identifying with this idea of growing up and you want to make those processes more conscious for you, I think Quest is a great access point and a good starting point to get involved.
Good transition, Christian.
Yeah, I bring that analytic, extroverted intuition. Let's do it.
Head over to personalityhacker.com/quest if you want to be a part of that. It is our Personality Quest program. Currently, right now, time of this recording, we're doing it on Sundays. We gather weekly with the community, a tribe of like minds, like-minded, growth-minded people that all want to apply some of these things we talk about to the self and figure out, okay, how can we actually improve our lives? How do we actually do this in a real way, not just an intellectual way? So come over and be part of that weekly. I think you'd really enjoy that experience.
Yeah, not just understand your challenges, but solve them.
Any last minute comments before we wrap up this episode? Because
I figured this would be one of the longer ones because it's like such a thorough thing to tap into, but it's a foundation point. You know, and I expect these episodes to be something that you revisit. So make sure you like save this as a favorite and come back to it later to almost track how you've started to grow through some of these understandings too.
Absolutely. Okay. So next episode, we're going to start talking about this idea of waking up.
Yep.
So we talked about growing up. We've got waking up, cleaning up, and showing up. But next episode, we're going to tune into the waking up aspect of that. Maybe a little preview. Is this like an awakening to what's possible? Is this awakening to what's wrong in our lives?
Well, you kind of mentioned that moment of having a kinesthetic experience in person. It's like that was kind of a peak experience for you to be able to step into a moment that you were ready for.
Okay.
And then you were kind of like lucid and alive to the fact that like, this is what I need to do. This is where I am in this kind of moment. So we're going to talk about things like that, like peak experiences. What does that look like? And, different avenues for what waking up to, making that transition from unconscious growth to conscious growth usually happens through a wake up moment. So what do those moments look like?
Excellent. So join us next week for that. And in the meantime, you've been the fourth person in this conversation. You haven't had a microphone, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. Stories are compressed experiences. And I think stories help us get a sense of where you're coming from, even more than just data, right? Stories are very important. Of course, I have bias. I have ENFP preferences. All the TIs in the world are like, what? Stories? I'm just going to give you the raw data points. But anyway, come over and make your voice heard. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and a review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot, and I read all of them. So please let us know how we're doing and whether or not you're enjoying the show. We very much appreciate it. You could be watching us on YouTube right now. We have a video podcast, and that, of course, is where we gather for our Quest calls. So if that's you and you're gathering here, you can subscribe, and ring the bell for future episodes. And if you're part of Quest, hello, and we'll be talking to you soon right afterwards to really find ways to apply what we learned today in our lives and do like really good review around it. So welcome to all our Quest members. And of course, I mean, I didn't say it this last time, but it's true. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
My name is Christian Rivera.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.